whispering in.
There are monsters in this world. And the worst part? They don't look like monsters. They look like someone you know. Someone you trust. But trust can be deadly. There's a name you need to remember. Casey Loyd. But not as a man. Not even as a criminal. Because what Casey Loyd did, it strips away any title, any human label. What he did was something else entirely. Something evil. Because real evil isn't loud. It doesn't storm into the room waving a knife, screaming threats. It smiles. It blends in. It waits. And that's what Casey Loyd did. 4 months, this man lived inside a house with a little girl. A child who had just started forming words. A child who should have spent her days playing with dolls, learning how to jump, how to laugh. A child who should have been safe. But she wasn't. Because Casey Loyd wasn't just in that house. He was watching. Calculating. And when the moment came, when no one was looking, he didn't snap in a fit of rage. No. This wasn't impulsive. This was something darker. Something planned. The things this man did to 2-year-old Koralynn Marie Fister, they are the kind of things that make you sick. They make you question how someone like this can exist, how a human being can inflict so much suffering on someone so small. Because Koralynn wasn't just killed. She was tortured. She was hurt in ways that defy logic, ways that go beyond what the mind can comprehend. This wasn't one bad night. This was a pattern. A daily nightmare. And her mother? She left her with him. Again. And again. Even when the bruises appeared. Even when Koralynn flinched at his touch. Even when neighbors started noticing something was wrong. But no one stopped it. And by the time the truth came out, it was far too late. This is the story of a monster who walked among us. Of a mother who failed to protect her own child. And of a little girl who never got the chance to grow up. Evil doesn't always come with a warning sign. It doesn't always announce itself. But if you look closely, sometimes there are cracks. Sometimes the monster slips. And if people had been paying attention, if they had been listening, maybe, just maybe, Koralynn would still be here. Because Casey Loyd? He didn't just wake up one morning and become a killer. He was always that way. He had always been dangerous. Casey had a past. One filled with violence. Women who had run from him terrified. Allegations of abuse, control, manipulation. Things that should have been red flags. But somehow he kept slipping through the cracks. This wasn't a man with one mistake in his past. He had patterns. A history. Ex-girlfriends who told stories of his rage. Instances of control. Of cruelty. Of things that should have made people stop and say, something isn't right. Police reports. Restraining orders. Warnings that weren't taken seriously enough. And yet, he still found his way into Koralynn's home. Grooming the mother. So how does someone like Casey Loyd get close to a child? Simple. He doesn't go for the child first. He goes for the mother. Koralynn's mother was vulnerable. Maybe she was looking for love, maybe she was struggling, maybe she just wanted someone to be there. And Casey knew exactly how to play that. He was charming at first. Helpful. He made her feel special, needed. He got close fast. And by the time things started to seem off, by the time the control started creeping in, it was too late. Because this wasn't love. This wasn't a relationship. This was a trap. And she walked right into it. Ignored warning signs. But here's where it gets worse. There were signs. People noticed things. They had a bad feeling about Casey. Maybe it was the way Koralynn flinched around him. Maybe it was how possessive he was with the mother. Maybe it was just that gut instinct, that voice in the back of their heads whispering, something isn't right. But nobody did anything. And that's the terrifying part. How many times do we ignore that feeling? How many times do we see a friend dating someone who gives us a bad vibe, but we don't say anything because we don't want to seem paranoid? If you got a bad feeling about someone dating your friend, would you speak up? Because if just one person had pushed harder, if just one person had said, this isn't normal, would Koralynn still be alive? The monster was in plain sight. But no one stopped him. And Koralynn paid the price. Koralynn Marie Fister was only 2 years old. Just beginning her life. She hadn't even had enough time to form full sentences yet, but she had words, tiny, precious words. Mommy. Up. Mine. She loved the color pink. She had a favorite blanket, soft, worn from being hugged too much, the corners frayed from tiny fingers gripping it for comfort. She dragged it everywhere, even when it got dirty, even when it smelled like peanut butter and grass. She had this giggle, high-pitched, contagious, the kind that made other people smile even if they didn't know why. She liked to spin in circles until she got dizzy, collapsing in a fit of laughter. She didn't understand danger. She didn't understand that the world had monsters in it. Because in her world, the people around her were supposed to protect her. She trusted them. Her mother? She loved her. She reached for her when she was scared, when she was sleepy, when she just wanted to be held. She looked at her mother like she was her whole world. Because that's what mothers are supposed to be, the safe place. And Casey? Koralynn didn't understand what he was. She just knew he was there. She knew he was someone her mother trusted, so she trusted him too. She had no idea that the very person inside her home was the reason her world was about to turn into a nightmare. It's hard to imagine, isn't it? A tiny girl, still learning how to say full sentences, still wobbling when she ran, still sleeping with stuffed animals. And yet, just a few feet away in that same house, was a man who had already decided what he was going to do to her. While she was playing with her toys, he was waiting. While she was laughing, twirling in circles, he was planning. While she was reaching for her mother, believing she was safe, she wasn't. And that's the part that hurts the most. She didn't know. She didn't know that the people who were supposed to protect her weren't going to. She had no reason to fight back. No reason to run. She was just a little girl. A little girl who deserved so much more. But in the end, all that trust, all that innocence, it meant nothing. Because the people around her let her down. And soon, Koralynn's world would go dark. Here's the part that hurts, the part that makes your stomach turn. Because monsters like Casey Loyd, they don't act alone. They don't get away with things like this without help. And the help? It came from the one person who should have protected Koralynn with her life. Her mother. The man she let in. She let him in fast. Too fast. Casey Loyd wasn't Koralynn's father. He wasn't even long-term. He was someone her mother met, trusted almost immediately, and allowed into their lives without hesitation. Maybe she was lonely. Maybe she was vulnerable. Maybe she just wanted someone to be there to tell her she was loved. And Casey? He knew exactly how to take advantage of that. He didn't show her the monster right away. At first he was helpful. Maybe he offered to watch Koralynn for a bit so she could have some time to herself. Maybe he seemed attentive, involved. He played the part perfectly. But there were signs. There are always signs. The first signs of abuse. It started small. It always starts small. A bruise here. A scrape there. Nothing obvious. And when she asked, oh, she tripped. She fell in the tub. You know how toddlers are, always running into things. Excuses. Excuses that should have been questioned. But she accepted them. Then there were changes in Koralynn's behavior. The way she stopped smiling as much. The way she flinched at sudden movements. The way she got quiet when Casey was in the room. And yet, her mother didn't leave. Even when Koralynn started clinging to her more. Even when she cried when left alone with him. And that's where the real question is. What? Why did she stay? Why did she ignore the bruises? Why didn't she listen to her daughter's unspoken cries for help? Because at some point, this wasn't just neglect. Turning a blind eye. And here's the hardest truth of all. She didn't have to lay a hand on Koralynn to be responsible for what happened to her. Because turning a blind eye? That can be just as dangerous as committing the crime. At what point does turning a blind eye become just as dangerous as committing the crime? Because if you see something, if you know something, and you do nothing, are you really innocent? Her mother made a choice. And that choice cost Koralynn her life. Pause. Let that last line sink in before transitioning. And when the truth finally came out, when the nightmare finally ended, it was already far too late. Evil doesn't happen all at once. It doesn't strike like lightning. It builds. It festers. It grows. And inside that house, behind closed doors, Koralynn was living in a nightmare. This wasn't a one-time act of violence. This wasn't an accident. This was a life of suffering. Because Casey Loyd wasn't just a killer. He was a sadist. And every single day he made sure Koralynn felt that. Imagine a 2-year-old, tiny, helpless, barely able to form sentences. Now imagine that child being treated like a punching bag. Bruises that never had time to heal before new ones formed. Small burns. Scratches. Injuries that made no sense for a toddler. Pain that no child should ever experience. She cried. Of course she cried. And Casey? He didn't care. He wanted her to suffer. It wasn't just physical. It was psychological. She stopped laughing as much. She started hiding. She was terrified of him. And yet, her mother kept leaving her alone with him. But perhaps one of the most chilling details, one that foreshadowed what would happen in the end, was the bathroom punishment. See, Casey had a routine. When he wanted to punish Koralynn, he wouldn't just hit her. He'd lock her in the bathroom. 4 hours. Alone. A 2-year-old. Imagine that. A toddler trapped. Scared. Crying. sitting in the dark, not understanding why she was being punished. And the worst part? It wasn't just isolation. Sometimes there was water. Maybe the tub was filled and she was left in there, cold, shivering, terrified. Maybe the water was too hot. Maybe he pushed her under just to see her struggle. We may never know exactly what happened during those punishments, but we know one thing: they got worse. And they set the stage for what happened on the final day. And where was Koralynn's mother during all of this? She knew. Maybe not everything, maybe not the worst of it, but she knew something. Neighbors noticed things. People warned her. She had chances, so many chances, to leave. And yet, she kept bringing Koralynn back. Back into that house. Back into the hands of a monster. She had a choice. And every time she left Koralynn alone with him, she made the wrong one. Pause. Let that sink in. The abuse didn't stop. It escalated. And then came the final day. There's always a final moment. A point where it's too late to stop the horror. For Koralynn, that moment came on May 24, 2012. She was just 2 years old. And this time she would never leave that house alive. That morning, Koralynn's mother did what she always did. She left. And once again she left her child alone with him. With the man who had already hurt her, broken her, tortured her. Maybe Koralynn cried when her mother walked out the door. Maybe she reached out for her, hoping, begging, to be taken with her. But the door closed. And she was trapped. Alone with Loyd. We don't know exactly what set him off that day. But we do know this. The abuse escalated beyond anything Koralynn had suffered before. She didn't just cry. She screamed. And Casey? He didn't stop. He beat her. He tormented her. And when that wasn't enough, he took her to the bathroom. The place where he had punished her before. The place where he would end her life. The water turned on. We don't know if he held her under to make her struggle. We don't know if she fought back, if her tiny hands clawed at him, desperate to survive. But we do know that when he was finished, Koralynn was barely clinging to life. She was so small, so helpless. And after everything she had endured, her body couldn't take it anymore. Casey knew what he had done. He saw her slipping away. But instead of calling for help, instead of trying to save her, he did something chilling. He dressed her wounds. Not out of guilt. Not because he cared. Because he was covering his tracks. Even in that moment, asterisk asterisk with a dying child in front of him, asterisk asterisk he was thinking about himself. By the time help arrived, Koralynn was gone. She was soaked, battered, lifeless. A 2-year-old who had spent her last moments in terror. And her mother? Was she shocked? Did she fall to her knees, screaming in agony? Or, deep down, did she know? Did she know that leaving Koralynn alone with him that morning was the same as signing her death certificate? Because that's the thing. This wasn't a tragedy that no one saw coming. This was a storm that had been building for months. And when it finally broke, the person who suffered the most was the only one who couldn't escape. Koralynn was gone. But Loyd? He wasn't. And now, it was time for justice. Koralynn was gone. But monsters don't disappear when they take a life. They stay. They lie. They make excuses. And Loyd? He wasn't done yet. When authorities arrived at the scene, Loyd didn't cry. He didn't scream. He wasn't in shock. No, he was disturbingly calm. Like this was nothing. Like Koralynn's battered little body was just another problem to deal with. When police questioned him, did he break down? Did he show an ounce of guilt? No. He tried to explain it away. He claimed he had been trying to help her. That her injuries were an accident. But the evidence? It told the truth. The bruises, layered, old and new. The water-related injuries, far beyond what could ever be explained. The history of abuse, because this wasn't the first time. And so, he was arrested. Loyd was charged with first-degree murder, rape, and assault. The kind of charges that leave no room for doubt. But even then, even when faced with the weight of what he did, he fought back. His defense. Excuses. Was. Deflection. Because that's what abusers do. They don't own their evil. They try to rewrite the story. But the jury? They saw through it. And in the end, there was no mercy for him, just like he had no mercy for Koralynn. The mother's accountability, victim or accomplice. But here's the question that split the community. What about Koralynn's mother? She left her daughter with Casey. She ignored the signs. She had chances, so many chances, to get her out. So, was she just another victim? Or was she partially to blame? Because here's the hard truth. Neglect can be just as deadly as abuse. And while Casey was the one who took Koralynn's life, her mother let him do it. But did she face consequences? That's where the legal system gets murky. Some argued she suffered enough, that she had to live with the guilt of knowing she could have stopped it, but didn't. Others said that's not enough, that a mother's first duty is to protect her child. And she failed. Audience engagement moment. What do you think? Should she have been charged? Or was she just another victim in Casey's web of manipulation? Let me know in the comments. Because cases like this, they don't have easy answers. Pause. Let the audience sit with the weight of it. Then transition. But one thing is clear. Casey Loyd is exactly where he belongs. And Koralynn? She never got the justice she truly deserved. When Casey Loyd walked into that courtroom, he didn't look like a monster. He wasn't snarling, wasn't raging. No, he was just a man. A man in handcuffs sitting before a judge. But that's what makes people like him so terrifying. Because monsters don't always come with fangs and claws. Sometimes they look normal. And that's how they get away with it. Did he show remorse? Not really. There was no true apology. No real grief. And when the verdict was read, he just took it. Like he had already made peace with the fact that his life was over. The verdict? Justice or just a legal conclusion? Casey Loyd was sentenced to life in prison without parole. That's it. No freedom. No second chance. For some, it was justice. A fitting end for a man who destroyed an innocent life. For others, it wasn't enough. Because no matter how many years he spends in a cage, Koralynn is still gone. And her suffering? It can't be undone. So was it justice? Or was it just the best the system could offer? A warning for parents, the red flags were there. But here's what really matters now. This wasn't just about one evil man. This was about all the warning signs that were ignored. The bruises that were brushed off. The fear in Koralynn's eyes. The gut feelings that people had, but didn't act on. How many chances did the world have to save her? And how many times was she left behind? Because the truth is chilling. Casey Loyd didn't operate in the shadows. He was right there in plain sight. And nobody stopped him. Final words, a lasting reminder. So here's what I want you to remember. Monsters don't always lurk in the dark. Sometimes they sit right next to you. And the worst thing you can do is ignore them. Because ignoring them? That's how Koralynn Marie Fister died. What should have been done differently? Could this tragedy have been prevented? Drop your thoughts below. I want to hear from you. And if you're into stories that need to be told, hit that subscribe button. Silent Weekend Crimes is just getting started.